We're going to go ahead and spend a little bit of time talking about the rise of Christianity because even though we don't have a lot of time to discuss it in the course of the chapter, it's very influential in world history, and so it's important that we lay some sort of foundation down for that very reason. I first of all have this really big quote for you, but I think it's really good. This is a quotation called "One Solitary Life" cited by Michael Green, who was the principal at St. John's College in Nottingham, England. But this kind of gives you a sense about the interesting character we're dealing with when we look at the historical Jesus. It says this: "Here is a man who was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant. He worked with his hands until he was 30. Then 3 years he was a teacher. He never owned a home. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never married. He never went to college. He never lived in a big city. He never traveled 200 miles from the place he was born. He never did one of the things that usually accompanies greatness. He had no credentials. While still a young man, popular opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies. He went through a trial. He was killed with 2 thieves. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. Centuries have come and gone. Today he is a centerpiece of the human race. All the armies that have ever marched, all the navies that were ever built, all the parliaments that ever sat, and all the kings that ever reigned put together have not affected the life of man upon this earth as powerfully as that one solitary life." And that's an interesting quotation. And even it really doesn't matter if you're a Christian or non-Christian, we can agree that the historical person of Jesus, for everyone, atheist, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, is an influential life, historically speaking. In fact, take a look at what E.P. Sanders, professor of religion from Duke University, wrote in his book, The Historical Figure of Jesus. He writes, "One spring morning in about the year 30 CE, 3 men were executed in Judea. 2 were thieves, the third was a political criminal. He had not robbed, pillaged, murdered, or even stored arms. He was convicted, however, having claimed to be King of the Jews, a political title. Those who looked down doubtless thought the world would little know what happened that spring morning. But it turned out that this third man, Jesus of Nazareth, would become the most important figure in human history." And that's quite a, quite a claim, quite a title, that this executed man who would die naked on a cross would ultimately become one of the most important figures in human history. Take a look at one other quote from famed Yale professor who wrote in his book Jesus Through the Centuries, published by Yale University Press. Right on page 1 he writes, "Regardless of what anyone may personally think or believe about him, Jesus of Nazareth has been the dominant figure in the history of Western culture for almost 20 years. If it were possible, with some sort of super magnet, to pull out of history every scrap of metal bearing at least a trace of his name, how much would be left?" And the idea here in this quotation is that Christianity and the person of Jesus has such a fingerprint on history, it'd be hard to take and remove the things that have been inspired, or the things that have been motivated, or the things that have come out of the Christian influence of the life of this historical person, Jesus. Well, as we talk about the historical person, Jesus, we need to talk about the context where he came from. So on your handout where it says Israel, we want to write down that they had been under Roman rule since the year 6 BCE. They had been under Roman rule since the year 6 BCE. And Jesus was Jewish, and that's odd for many people to think about or understand. Because there's been so much anti-Semitism or discrimination against Jewish people, sometimes from people from a Christian background or Christian culture. But Jesus was a Jew. The apostles were Jews. The Bible was a book of the Jewish people. And so Jesus' his story is heavily rooted in the nation of Israel. Every time Jesus encountered or talked or spoke, Jesus was constantly referring people to the Bible. Whenever Jesus had a conflict or disagreement, he would always tell his audiences, according to the Gospels, "Have you never read the Scriptures?" And he would constantly point people to previous prophets as a way to figure out what was true or what was not true, and also would cite his own authority, which would get him in trouble. Here on this particular picture is a picture of the temple. The Jews, as you might recall, had a single temple in Jerusalem, It was for the daily sacrifice of animals for the forgiveness of sins, but that first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. In the Babylonian captivity, the Persians allowed them to rebuild, and ultimately, this is the temple that they rebuild here. Massive temple in Jerusalem, inspired. Take a look. You'll see that there's columns in this temple. That's a great example of Hellenization, or the inspiration of Greek culture, Hellenization. And so they were inspired a bit in the architecture with having columns and pillars from Greek architecture. But not only did the Greeks come, but listen, the Romans did as well. And with the Romans ruling Israel since 6 BC, there was a hope, a desire of the nation of Israel for someone to come and to save them. In fact, on your handout it says hope in a Messiah. I want you to write down for hope in a Messiah. That word Messiah literally means anointed one. Anointed one. And the Jews were hoping that there would be a Messiah, an anointed one, a special deliverer who would come and save the nation of Israel and would really destroy the Roman Empire. And so Jesus was not the first or the last person to claim to be a Messiah. In fact, many people came before Jesus, several after Jesus, but the difference is that every one of those other people that claimed to be the Messiah, and the word Christ is just the Greek form of that Hebrew word Messiah. So you could say Jesus the Messiah or Jesus Christ. They're the same thing. It means the anointed one. Many people claim to be that, but after all of these individuals ultimately were put on trial by Rome or executed by Rome, all the movements that they started would die, and nothing more came of all these different claims to be a Messiah or a leader. And this is where we get to the character of Jesus and Nazareth. We want to write down Jesus of Nazareth was a carpenter, that he was from a very small community in the northern part of modern day Israel. In fact, we know that Jesus of Nazareth, who grew up in Nazareth, was a man who grew up in a town of only 400 people. In fact, we've actually excavated Nazareth. This is a home that we've excavating in from the time of Jesus, and we can see that there's only just really a few very small homes that date to his time period. And so knowing that only 400 people lived in Nazareth, it's not unlikely that this home that we're looking at here was a home that he had walked by or knew the people that lived there or had spent time inside of this home, because Nazareth was so small. And so it's a real place that we can go and visit. And Jesus, this carpenter from Galilee, we're told that, he was a carpenter like his father. And this is one of the things that took people by surprise. Whenever he did anything, people would always say, well, isn't this Jesus of Nazareth? Isn't his father a carpenter? Don't we know this guy? They were surprised at the things that he said and the things that he did. One of the things that happened is that he gained a reputation as an exorcist and a healer. That word exorcist, you might be familiar from movies about what that word means. But an exorcist is a person that basically encounters the spiritual world of the demonic. And Jesus, in these New Testament stories, showed that he had authority over the demonic world. There's constantly stories that when Jesus would meet someone who was demon-possessed, the demons would say, we know who you are. You're Jesus of Nazareth. Have you come to destroy us? Have you come to torture us before Judgment Day? And so Jesus would show he had total authority over the world of the demonic. He wasn't communicating with them in the sense of asking them for advice or favors, but judging them. Other things Jesus came to be known of in his reputation, not only as an exorcist, but also as a healer, constantly encountering people that were sick, people that were blind, people that had contagious skin diseases. And with the Ebola crisis of 2014, and even with recent announcements that Dallas, Texas had a confirmed case in September of 2014, you can imagine people today and people in West Africa keeping their distance from people that had contagious diseases. Well, the same thing was true back at this time. And Jesus, we'll see throughout the New Testament accounts, constantly had instances of healing people that were considered unclean. Jesus was constantly reconnecting people who were disconnected from their communities. And Jesus was constantly abolishing the distance that separated people that were looked down upon, or people who were feared, or people who were judged because of their disformities or diseases. Jesus brought these people back into the community by the things that he did, while he touched people in a way that other people would be afraid to. But Jesus claimed uh, this power and gained this reputation to be an exorcist and also as a healer. In fact, this idea of him as a healer has caused a lot of discussion in historical circles. One quotation from E.P. Sanders, who teaches religion at Duke University, wrote this. He said, "Several facts about Jesus' career and its aftermath can be known beyond doubt. Any interpretation of Jesus should be able to account for these. These almost indisputable facts include that Jesus was a Galilean who preached and healed." And so this is, in fact, really a historical idea that there are reports of him being involved in these really difficult to explain encounters with individuals. Even a very famous non-Christian and really atheistic historian of the middle of the 20th century wrote, "There can be no doubt that Jesus did the kinds of deeds which were miracles in his mind and the minds of his contemporaries." So there's no need, of course, for us to believe that these were miracles, uh, but we can definitely say that Jesus' followers and Jesus himself thought that these were miracles. And so that is what people absolutely did think at the time. So looking at the handout where it says claims, what did Jesus claim? Well, he did claim to be the Messiah. And according to some people, there is also the belief that Jesus may well have claimed to be God. And that's because Jesus did a lot of interesting things. One of the things that Jesus often did that gets him accused of claiming to be God is Jesus claimed the ability to forgive sins. And whenever Jesus told people that their sins were forgiven, people were often offended, and they said, "Who are you, a man, to forgive sins?" But this was a constant claim that Jesus was doing, walking up to individuals and telling them, "Listen, your sins have been forgiven." Something that people had said was only something that God would have the authority to do. Jesus claimed he could do. Another thing that got Jesus a bit into trouble with his claims was that he claimed that there would be an ultimate judgment based on what people decided about him. And that's an incredible thing, that a man would claim things about himself that would require you to make a decision lest you have an unfortunate eternity. And the way Jesus talked, he showed that he had this unparalleled closeness with someone he called God the Father. If you look at a couple of quotations, one from Richard Bauckham, who wrote a book called Jesus, A Very Short Introduction, published by Oxford University Press, he writes this: "Jesus could speak as though people's eternal destiny depended on their response to Jesus himself." And that's a very radical way for a person to discuss themselves, saying that individual's eternal destiny depended on what you said or thought or felt about one man. Here's a quotation from Jesus in Luke 12, verse 8 and 9. Jesus once is reportedly to have said, "Everyone who acknowledges me before other men, the Son of Man will also acknowledge before the angels of God. But whoever denies me before others will be denied before the angels of God." And so quite a radical claim, that to deny the Son of Man, which was actually Jesus' most common title for himself. Whenever Jesus talks about himself, he calls himself the title Son of Man more than any other title. That's a radical claim that Jesus makes for himself, that to reject him is to reject God and be rejected. To acknowledge him is to acknowledge what God is doing and to be acknowledged by God on the judgment day. But you can imagine that these claims to forgive sins, these claims to, in the eyes of some, to be God, gets him in trouble with the religious authorities of the time. In fact, the people that Jesus is most upsetting very often were the religious leaders who he critiqued and he challenged. These were people that he often spoke against because of what he believed was corruption and hypocrisy. And of course, this is not a new thing that people in power would be corrupt, or people in power um, would be filled with behaviors that did not line up with the responsibilities that they should have had. Well, these claims will get him in trouble with not just religious authorities, but the Roman authorities as well. Now, Jesus famously enters into Jerusalem, and if you look at this picture, Jesus is greeted on his last of his 3 years of public ministry. Jesus only taught for 3 years. In his last trip to Jerusalem, he's greeted with people waving palm branches. This last Sunday in Jerusalem, coming in, cheered as a hero with people waving palm branches, is where we get the holiday called Palm Sunday. Back at this time, waving palm branches was a way of the crowds to show support, to show allegiance, to say that they believed in this man. And so it was a way of cheering and acknowledging him publicly as Messiah. But as you can imagine, crowds of thousands believing that Jesus is a Messiah led some to believe that he was going to overthrow Rome. And any challenge to Rome is a challenge that must be dealt with. Jesus famously gathered his disciples for a last meeting called the Last Supper, where he instituted a Christian belief that's called communion. Whether you're Protestant or Catholic, all Christian communities celebrate communion in one form or fashion as a meal that does, in some way, bring remembrance to for something Jesus said was important. Jesus said that the breaking of the bread symbolized his soon-to-come breaking of his body, that the wine would symbolize the soon-to-be poured-out blood. And so for Jesus, it's interesting that it appears in the gospel narratives that we have today in the New Testament that he seems to anticipate his death, and instead of his death being a final blow to close his ministry, his death is an authenticating necessity for his ministry, something that has to be done, but something that will get him in trial. Here's a picture of Jesus on the far left being kissed on the cheek by Judas Iscariot. And we do see very early that there's this tradition that Jesus was betrayed by one of the 12 apostles. In fact, Jesus famously at the Last Supper tells his friends, listen, one of you is going to betray me this very night. Peter, one of the apostles, says, hey, Jesus, I don't know about these other guys, but I will fight for you. I'll die for you to the end. I'll never, never forsake you. And what happens is later, Jesus goes into the Garden of Gethsemane, a garden that we can actually visit to today and go to. And there, one of his followers who had slipped out during the course of the Last Supper comes and greets Jesus with a kiss, which would not have been uncommon for men at this time to greet friends in that way. But that was simply a way of identifying Jesus to a group of guards who would arrest Jesus. At that time, Peter would pull out a sword and trying to defend Jesus, actually chopped off one of the guards' ears and then ran away. Unfortunately, Peter, though filled with bravery for a moment, would go on to deny Jesus 3 different times that night, claiming when people said, hey, aren't you Peter, one of the disciples? Peter, to his shame, said, I don't even know the guy. You got the wrong man. And so rejected Jesus 3 different times. Ultimately, Jesus does go on trial. And Jesus' trial is before this gentleman in the very center, Pontius Pilate, who is the Roman governor that puts him on trial. And Pontius Pilate is the Roman governor who executes him. And here, Jesus is stripped onto the left. He would have been whipped before going to the cross. We know a lot about Roman execution methods, and we know that Jesus would have been tortured with a tool called a cat o' nine tails. This was a whip with 9 different parts of the whip that would have pieces of bone, pieces of glass, pieces of stone, and this whip would tear into the back of a prisoner. And there's accounts that some prisoners did not make it past this phase of the torture, and that it was not uncommon for bones or intestines to be exposed from that portion of the punishment phase. Pontius Pilate, of course, put Jesus to death on the cross, and we have a word that comes from crucifixion. In fact, there's a word that we use to this day for great pain. If you were to say you were in excruciating pain, think about that word, excruciating, Cruciating, excruciating. That word excruciating literally means from the cross. And when Romans looked at people being crucified, they saw these men in pain and said, there's not a word that exists to describe the pain I see in that man's eyes. And so they had to invent a word to describe the pain of being crucified. That word is excruciating. And it would have been excruciating. It's very common that people, when they were crucified, would have their arms dislocated to get their arms to fit in, as they would put a nail through either wrist to hold up the weight. Here at this picture, the nail's through the hands, but we know that it likely was through the wrist. Your hand isn't strong enough to support your weight, and then a nail will go through the either feet. There's a sign above Jesus's head. Here it says INRI, which stands for Jesus, or Jesus of Nazareth, the N. The Rex of Judea. Rex is king. Judea would be the Jews. So it's Jesus, the I, Rex, the R, and Nazareth, and the I representing the Jews. And so that's the crime. He, claiming to be king of the Jews, means that Caesar is not, and that is the death penalty. Well, what happens after this story is we see this idea that Jesus is buried by followers. In fact, J.A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University wrote that the burial of Jesus in the tomb is, quote, one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus, that a wealthy man took Jesus off the cross and was allowed to bury him nearby. On your handout, the followers were originally scattered with Jesus' arrest. In fact, we know all the male disciples, except for the Apostle John, abandoned Jesus. And so the original followers scattered. And these original followers were very diverse. They included the poor. They included prostitutes. They included tax collectors. And to a lot of people's shock, they included women. And that last part is the real shocker, because of all the people that stood by Jesus' side, it was only the women who finally stayed to the end. At the cross, there would be Jesus' mother, other women who were included, Mary Magdalene, and of course John the Apostle being the only one. But reports quickly circulated that something had happened. As we look at the evidence, there was some doubt whether crucifixion ever did really happen, and some people thought that the New Testament made this up. Maybe they thought, well, would they just tie a rope to these bodies? But in fact, if you take a look, we found a man's foot. To the right is the actual find. To the left is a reconstruction, so you have a better idea of what it would look like, of a nail still embedded in the remains of a foot. So did the Romans do this? Absolutely. There's good, solid physical evidence that they did. Women, as we finished talking about just last time, interestingly, on your handout it says reports quickly circulated. We'll write down that there was an empty tomb. And the first witnesses to the tomb were shockingly women. And that's very unusual, because women at this time were considered childlike. Women at this time were considered emotional, easily deceived. Some women were not considered worthy to stand as witnesses in trial scenes. And despite that fact, in the New Testament, it places women as the first witnesses to the resurrection. And so we'll write down, reports quickly circulated there was an empty tomb and that Jesus had been resurrected. And that is what really separates Jesus from all the other people who ever claimed to be Messiah. No other Messiah claim included someone who said that there was a claim that they had risen from the dead. But this is what we see very on with women, of all the weird choices historically, as the first witnesses, which has caused a lot of discussion. Why would they create a story with the most unreliable witnesses being the witnesses, that being the voice of women? There are stories that Jesus then appeared to skeptical family members and to his fellow apostles. In this famous painting, you have Jesus with an apostle in the very forefront named Thomas. And Thomas has a nickname. He's called Doubting Thomas, because when all the other apostles said, hey, we saw Jesus, we saw him physically risen from the dead, Thomas told his fellow apostles, hey, I have to see it to believe it. I won't believe this story. You're telling me Jesus rose from the dead. I have to see it with my eyes, put my finger in the hole in his side. He was stabbed in the side by the Romans. He said, I have to put my finger in his hand, then I'll believe it. The New Testament Gospel of John accounts that Jesus appeared to to Thomas physically and said, hey, Thomas, take your hand, put it in my side, put your finger, put in the hole in my hand, be not unbelieving, but be believing. To which Thomas responded, Jesus, you are my Lord and my God. And there it is again, those claims that Jesus is God. Thomas looking at Jesus saying, my Lord, my God. To which Jesus doesn't correct Thomas or say, oh no, Thomas, you got it wrong. I'm just a fellow servant like you. To which Jesus actually tells Thomas, when he says, my Lord, my God, he says, blessed are you, Thomas, for you have believed. So the reports do have an impact. Now, Jesus does have skeptical family members. In fact, where it says skeptical family members, write down the name James. James was an apostle, or rather, James was a brother of Jesus. And we know that there are accounts in the Gospels that Jesus' family did not believe in Jesus' ministry. There's a story in the New Testament when Jesus is preaching that it says his family had come to where Jesus was preaching because they thought he was insane. They thought he was out of his mind. So they thought, oh, there's crazy big brother Jesus claiming to be the Messiah. And they wanted to actually take him home from being a teacher because they thought he was embarrassing the family. But even a skeptical family member like James will write down, came to believe in the resurrection. So you had Thomas, who was a doubter, come to believe in the resurrection. James, who thought his brother was insane, who didn't even show up to see his brother executed on the cross, who later would become a leader in the early Christian church. Two different ways we can look at what happened to Jesus. That Jesus has inspired different views. We're looking at two very different ones. One is from N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, who says this about the resurrection. He says, that is why, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. And so N.T. Wright, considered by some to be like the number one British historian on Jesus, says, look, it's the evidence is that he rose from the dead. Another view from John Dominic Crossan, interviewed in Time magazine, says the tales of entombment and resurrection were just latter-day wishful thinking. Instead, Jesus' corpse went the way of all abandoned criminal bodies. It was probably just barely covered with dirt, vulnerable to wild dogs that roamed the wasteland of the execution grounds. So Jesus has inspired many different points of view. Some people say, yep, Jesus rose from the dead. That's the only reason that you could have a church begin. That's the only way Christianity could start. And others, like John Dominic Crossan, said, nah, Jesus' body is probably missing because it was eaten by wild dogs. Richard Bauckham, again, in his book published by Oxford University Press, concludes the situation this way. He writes, one can perhaps get no further than saying something must have happened for Jesus' disciples, left deeply disillusioned by Jesus' death, to come to believe that God had raised him from death. Had Jesus' story ended with his death on the cross, he too would have just been remembered as a failed would-be Messiah. Without some sort of new beginning, whatever it might have been, there would have been no Christian faith and no Christian movement. In other words, though we may not be 100% sure what exactly happened to Jesus' body, Richard Bauckham suggests something must have happened to create the start of a brand new world religion. Here's a famous painting of a man being knocked off his horse, and this man on the handout is Saul to Paul. We know that there was an individual named Saul who was a Christian killer. He was a persecutor of early Christianity. He did not believe in the Christian story at all. In fact, he found it highly offensive, and the Bible tells us that he made it his living, he made it his job to round up Christian communities as Christians were spreading and growing and talking about this so-called resurrected Jesus, that Paul traveled throughout the Roman Empire, wrote letters, and tried to get Christians arrested until one day on the road to Damascus, Saul was knocked off his horse and heard a voice say, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? To which Saul said, who are you, Lord? And the voice responded, I am Jesus, who you are persecuting. And so from this experience, Saul has a major conversion. He gets a name change to, guess what? Look at your name, your handout. His name becomes Paul. And this man who was once a Christian killer becomes a Christian promoter, and he would write much of the current New Testament that is in the Bible today. Because he is a Roman citizen, he would write in Greek. He would go to cities, and he would use the relative peace of the Roman Empire to be able to safely travel from one town to the next, helping Christianity to spread throughout the Roman Empire, using Roman roads and the Roman peace to make this travel all around the Roman Empire the way that the Christian religion would grow. So he's going to be one of the most famous apostles, and he's the person who will later be known as Saint Paul, but he was a Christian killer at first. And as I mentioned, he will write much of the New Testament. If you look at this picture, take a look at what's in the table below Paul. As Paul's writing, you see an image of who? Well, that's Jesus, and the idea in the Christian narrative is that Jesus is inspiring these books about his life and about his teachings, and that's Paul the Apostle. And this shows you the different cities that Paul would travel to: Rome, Thessalonica, Philippi, Ephesus, Colossae, and a lot of these would become books of the Bible. The visit to Galatia will be a book of Galatians, Colossians, Ephesians, Philippians, Thessalonians, Corinthians, and the book of Romans. These are all Roman cities in the Roman Empire that Paul would use Roman roads to get to. And really, the Roman Empire and the peace that the Roman Empire brought was the perfect tool and mechanism to spread a brand new world religion. The Christian early movement not only did they get persecution from people like Paul, but they also got persecuted from the Roman Empire itself. In fact, Christians were often rounded up and executed. If you take a look at this, Christians were thrown in the Colosseum, often lit on fire. There's stories and documented occurrences where Christians would be persecuted in very creative ways. Sometimes they would take a bull, a giant massive bull, and the Romans would open the insides of the bull and remove the stomach and put a Christian still alive in the stomach of this bull and sew it up. At that point, they would release hungry dogs who had not eaten, and they would see these bulls in the middle of an arena and think it's lunchtime, and as they dug into this bull carcass, the Christian would be inside, still alive, but not for long, as they were consumed. There's yet another story of one Roman emperor who dipped Christians in tar and lit them on fire at night to light his garden so that he could walk through his property and enjoy the persecution of these people who refused to say that Caesar was God. These people who believed in this Jewish man was their savior and Messiah. In fact, this persistence of these Christians to believe what they believed was also something that the Jews themselves had as well. In the handout in the year 70, the Jews revolted against Rome, and unfortunately this would be a failed rebellion against Rome. In fact, here this is a documented imagery of Romans taking loot from the city of Jerusalem. It was a failed rebellion against Rome. The city of Jerusalem was destroyed, melted. That beautiful temple the Jews had built was destroyed yet again. Here, if you go to Jerusalem today, you can still see the stones of the temple that were thrown off the Temple Mount that exists there. This temple that did exist was completely destroyed. An architectural wonder, completely obliterated and leveled. In fact, today, if you take a look at this right here is what's called Temple Mount. It's this kind of like a rectangular platform. There was a temple on it, but it was leveled clear. The buildings that are on top of Temple Mount today only is this Muslim building, which is one of the most famous buildings in the world, called the Dome of the Rock. But the entirety of the temple was leveled by the Roman Empire. Some Jews hope and pray that one day they'll build a third temple on that site, but you can imagine the difficulty of trying to do that with it being a holy site for Muslims. In fact, there is an announcement there saying that it's forbidden for a person to enter the Temple Mount for a Jew to enter there, because you recall that somewhere on that site was the Holy of Holies, a site that only the high priest could enter one day out of the year on the Day of Atonement. So it's a place that's off limits to Jews today, but Muslims use it in their different practices as they visit the Dome of the Rock. This is the site of the very last, one of the last battles on your handout where it says Masada. We'll write down all Jewish defenders died. In fact, the Jews hid on this mountain and they thought they'd be safe from a mountain. But take a look at the picture on the right. Notice that there's something leading up to the mountain. What the Romans did is said, oh, you're going to hide on a mountain and think you're safe? Well, we're just going to build a road and bring our army to you. The Jews decided that it'd be better for them to commit suicide than how the Romans capture and humiliate them. So every Jewish defender of Masada took their own life rather than being taken by the Roman Empire. The Romans, to mock the Jews, made coins. Here, take a look at the right of a Jewish man on a knee being conquered by the Roman Empire. On the handout, also make sure you write down that Herod's temple was destroyed, and there was a diaspora, or a kicking out of the Jews from the Holy Land, yes, yet again, as the Romans spread the Jewish people throughout the Roman Empire. And what about the Christians? They did not participate in this rebellion, and this is one reason why Christianity and Judaism split. It used to be that Christians was like a denomination of being Jewish, but because the Christians did not support the rebellion, from this point on, we see the Jewish religion and the Christian religion becoming two different separate movements. The Christians did not participate in this rebellion against Rome, and early Christians would experience years of persecution until, we'll write down years of persecution until Constantine's conversion. And Constantine's conversion, this was a Roman emperor who claimed in the middle of a battle to see a cross in the sky, and he claimed that there was a voice that said, Constantine, in this sign conquer. He painted Christian crosses on his soldiers' shields. They won a battle, and he decided that Christianity should now be a legal faith, and this is the turning point for Christianity. Finally, for early Christians, we also want to write down they produced the New Testament. I'm going to talk to you very briefly and have you write just a few more things on how we got the New Testament. This was actually before Constantine, the New Testament was written. Within a generation of the life of the people who knew Jesus, they started writing things about what things he said, things that they did. But you know that it's very difficult for books to stand the test of time. Books are brittle. Books are easily destroyed. How many copies of the New Testament do we have? Take a look at this chart. This chart consists of some major works by major writers, from Aristotle to an author known as Pliny the Younger. There's Herodotus, there's Julius Caesar, there's a Roman historian named Tacitus, there's Homer. This is showing you in red how many copies of manuscripts we have, with Aristotle just a few. The second greatest amount of copies we have of any document are the works of Homer, but then look at the New Testament. To give you a better idea of how many copies we have, looking at just a chart where Herodotus, a Greek historian, from when he wrote his book to the first copy we have in our hands, there is 1,350 years between when it was written to we have a copy in our hands, and we only have today in the world 8 copies. Think of Plato, from when he lived to the first physical copy in a museum, 1,300 years, with only 7 copies in the world. Or Julius Caesar, who wrote, from when he wrote to when we have a physical copy, we see 1,000 years pass. Or look at Pliny, who wrote his natural history, 750 years from when he wrote it to the first physical copy. And then look, we only have 7. But then look at the New Testament. How many years from the death of Jesus to the New Testament begins? We have 50 years from when Jesus died to when the first copy is physically in existence. And look how many copies we have in the New Testament, 5,366, which compared to anything else is amazing. This other chart also gives you another example of comparison of how much time there is from when the author wrote or recorded it to the date of the manuscripts that we have in our hands today, the time span, and how many copies exist. In fact, if you take a look in the very bottom, the second is Homer with 643 copies of his works. The New Testament, there's 5,700 copies, which is incredible. In fact, it says in the very bottom, the New Testament copies include fragments, incomplete copies of the New Testament, the complete New Testament, which are in Greek. Plus, look at this, another 10,000 manuscripts that exist in Latin, plus more than 1 million quotations from church fathers. In fact, this is an interesting quotation from Princeton scholar Bruce Metzger, who died a couple years ago. It says, if all other sources of our knowledge of the text of the New Testament were destroyed, These quotations would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. Like when you quote someone, you're recording what someone said. Basically what Bruce Metzger is saying is that if every copy of the Bible we have from the ancient world, those 5,000 copies, if they were all burned, that there was people that lived at the time that quoted the Bible, who wrote in their diaries or wrote in their journals, who wrote sermons and said, oh yeah, didn't you know the gospel said, and they quoted Jesus. If we collected all the copies of the quotes that people said at that time in their original early manuscripts, we could recreate the entire New Testament, even if we lost every copy of the Bible that we have from the ancient world. Even though there are approximately 300,000 variants in the textual New Testament, the two texts agree almost 98% of the time. So where we have on the handout early Christians, they were persecuted until the conversion of Constantine. We'll also write down they created the New Testament. We want to write down there's over 5,000 copies in Greek, still on early Christians, 5,000 copies in Greek, and these are 98% identical. And look at what about the 2%? Look at the rest of the quote. The vast majority of these differences are so minor that they neither show up in translation nor affect exegesis, which means teaching or interpretation. That there are so many copies, and when we compare them, they're 98% the same. The differences are minor. They don't affect a thing as far as the translation. Finally, what about other gospels? Sometimes you hear about people saying, oh, what about the lost gospels? Richard Bauckham, again, in his Oxford University Press book, Jesus, a very short introduction, writes, there about other gospels that exist that didn't make it into the New Testament. He says this about them, that there is no attempt in these other gospels to tell the story of Jesus' historical life. The four gospels have every appearance of being good history. The so-called Gnostic gospels do not. And so truly what we have with the four books that we have in the New Testament today are the oldest books that tell us anything about a gospel or about a biography of Jesus. Every other book that claims to be a gospel was not included in the Bible for good reasons. It was written way after the fact, not within the generation of the eyewitnesses, and they show not to even try to be telling history, while the four gospels that we have do. Final thing we'll write down for early Christians is that the four New Testament Gospels are the earliest biographies of Jesus. The four New Testament Gospels are the earliest biographies of Jesus. Jesus, of course, worshiping a crucified man was very embarrassing. Here we have an ancient piece of graffiti that was left in the Roman world. This is an actual piece of graffiti that reads, Alexamos worshiping God. If you look at it, it's a donkey on a cross. And sometimes people say that if someone is a foolish person, he is, there's an expression like you're being a jackass. And so here, think about the negative connotation of Christianity. That when they say this guy's worshiping God and they put a donkey on the cross, to be a Christian in the first century is to be mocked, to be ridiculed, to be executed and killed. To be a Christian in the first century meant that you had to know that you know what you believed was something you were willing to stand by, because it wouldn't become an acceptable religion for hundreds of years, but it would